Thank you very much. Thank you for joining us for the Balancing Freedom and Compliance. Should DEXs be regulated? I won't take a long time on the introductions. You've all been sitting here for some fantastic speeches about why DEX shouldn't be regulated, so I guess we'll have to jump straight into it. Now, first up, I'm going to turn to Charles. Charles, the CEO of the world's leading DEX for perpetual futures, and previously headed the Hong Kong department FinTech. So you've got both policy side and a policy side, and also from industry now. So could you give a brief introduction to what are the difficulties in regulating a decentralized exchange?
Absolutely. So I think when I look at decentralized exchanges and DeFi in general, there is really 5 things coming to mind. The first thing is decentralization. Decentralization, if you want to put into layman terms and try to map it over what regulators think about, decentralization is essentially an upgrade of the way we transact. In traditional finance, 2 different entities are transacting with one another, and when you look at decentralization and what DeFi brings, is essentially a new paradigm shift where users are transacting with protocols, and protocols are not really entities, and we can touch on this later on. So the first benefit of the way of decentralization is really core to the industry, and it's very important to be understood by the practitioners, the early adopters, but also the regulators. So it creates a very big paradigm shift where you cannot really regulate anymore entities, but you have to regulate a flow, which is happening on public blockchains, which brings transparency, which brings security also. There is no custody of the asset which is lost by the users anymore, so there are benefits, transparency and security, but also the flow is totally different. So this big challenge for regulators, it's who exactly to regulate now in this new kind of setup. And I believe conversation should be progressing towards not only controlling these entities, because the flow is kind of broken now. There is protocols which are part of these transactions with users, should they be individuals or regulated entities, but thinking how we can eventually monitor the risk and moving away from a control type of regulations to risk monitoring, because we don't have the opportunity to regulate the full flow of entities, but now there is a big part which is technology, and technology cannot really be regulated. Operators over technology can, but technology cannot be regulated. So I think we will see in the coming years, different parts of the world are moving at different pace, where regulators will essentially leverage the technology itself, where they can get an instant view of the marketplace via these public blockchains, knowing exactly who is doing what, and thinking how the technology can essentially support the monitoring of the flows rather than regulating the entities themselves. And maybe the last point also why it's important to think deeply about regulations of DEXs in general, it's putting the DEXs in the context of the new infrastructure for finance. It's very strategic for any international financial center to be totally aware and embrace the upgrade of the financial rails, which is happening before our eyes, and really enabling these new technologies of DeFi and decentralization and those public blockchains, ledgers, to really upgrade their financial industry overall. It's not only fintech anymore, it should be fintech plus infrastructure. And DeFi and DEXs are strategic infrastructures which any jurisdictions cannot let on the side for too long, because I would say the train has started to go, and we see the numbers, we see the engagement here, for example, at ADGM Finance Week, how many people are talking about digital assets and how this kind of migration or expansion towards the blockchain and DeFi rails is expanding.
No, well, I think we're all excited to see where the train will end up, or at least where it's going to take us along the journey. So, Jon, turning to you, so you're the policy lead at Uniswap, one of the largest DEXs in the world, and previously you were at the European Commission. I think we've heard on the last panel about how DeFi was kept out of MiCA, and I understand you were part of the team involved in that. So what do you see as the benefits and risks and regulation of DEXs?
Yeah, thank you. So I think building on what Charles said, I think what we see as the benefit when we talk about fully decentralized protocols or true DeFi, I think it's the open innovation that it actually brings. If you have these public blockchains that are technically immutable and there's no one in control, that allows people to build new types of financial services and technology on top of that. So the Uniswap protocol is used by a lot of Uniswap Labs' competitors as well because it just drives liquidity. So it's accessible to everyone. Like Charles says, if you're technically capable, you don't need to use any kind of tool by a commercial entity. You can simply connect yourself. You can provide liquidity yourself. If you are a traditional market maker that wants to go into the crypto space, you can build tools and you can start providing liquidity without any obstacles at all. And I think what we see as well is we see then additional layers being built on top. So you have all these applications that simply use the same infrastructure. So Uniswap sits on different chains, but primarily it started on Ethereum, and then it's just another application, it's another layer that people can all use to have the same standards, the same protocols. And I think to your point on why is it difficult, that's exactly why it's almost impossible to regulate it. I mean, you could come up with standards. You could say there was a specific way that you needed to build new versions of protocols, but since they are immutable and they will run forever and ever and ever, there's still Uniswap v1, Uniswap v2, now it's on Uniswap v3, but as long as Ethereum is turned on, as long as the internet is turned on, they just keep running. So where you have to look from a regulatory perspective is really figuring out, but what are the actual risks? Since this has, knock on wood, never been hacked, the actual risk sits on the outer layers. We need to figure out, the comparison with centralized exchanges, do people know when we go to retailers, do they know what they're doing? Or should we put an obligation on some of these new tools that help them transact directly with each other to assist them in understanding the economic actions that they're about to enter into, right? So I think it's about explaining or educating regulators how you must protect or you must have the base layer remain incredibly neutral. That has to be jurisdiction agnostic in my view, because you couldn't incorporate all the different rules of all the different jurisdictions into the protocol, and it could be outdated very quickly. And then you're again at the mercy of liquidity actually going to a new version if you implemented new changes. So I think that's why you have to try to figure out together, industry and the public sector, what is the appropriate regulatory hook. And again, I think it's important when we say all decentralized exchanges, but it is like the normal flow if you are new to crypto and you don't for some reason have them already, you would always pass through a payment service provider or a regulated exchange where we do your KYC, you would buy crypto, you would then go into a non-custodial wallet, and then perhaps when you are a bit more educated yourself, you would start transacting peer-to-peer. Because most users still come on to centralized exchanges, mainly for the ease of use. It looks more similar to something they're used to dabbling in.
To build on this very quickly, I think it's our responsibility as DeFi practitioners to stay engaged with regulators, and I will go beyond educating. I will go beyond claiming that DeFi is better for all kinds of reasons we just talked, but essentially demonstrating, because this is obvious when people take the time or have the chance to get a professional to explain to them how is the agenda of regulators, which is protecting investors and keeping healthy marketplaces, how this agenda of regulators very elegantly overlap with the capabilities and the intrinsic, I would say, design of DeFi. DeFi does not take custody of any assets. DeFi and the decentralized exchanges are transparent by nature when they're properly designed. So I think it's really our role and our responsibility to engage and demonstrate, not only claiming.
No, I fully agree with the engagement point, and turning then to Can, who's head of legal at Backpack and formerly GC at one of the world's largest centralized exchanges. You no doubt have had plenty of regulatory interactions in the past. How, in your view, has regulation impacted SEX's centralized exchanges, and what are the implications for that regulatory discussion for DEXs going forward?
I appreciate it. So I think we're all actually talking about the same thing, but I'm going to slice it a little different way. So I think the distinction between centralized exchanges and decentralized exchanges, it's actually a continuum rather than a black and white line. I think there's features of certain DEXs that are actually more centralized. You have a more centralized front end. You have a more centralized multi-sig. You have a more centralized cross-chain bridge. You have a more centralized upgradability key or some sort of admin super keys. So there, in my view, it's a whole continuum between centralized to decentralized exchanges, and so it doesn't quite make sense to talk about the two as if they're polar opposites. It's really more of a continuum. In fact, we've even seen centralized exchanges adopting more on-chain components as well. So in terms of the lessons, I think that could be learned from centralized exchanges. I think there's a principle that a lot of regulators sort of look to, which is same risk, same regulation. If you look at a DeFi protocol, obviously if it's fully immutable and there's no custody, then it's hard to actually even find a legal actor that you can regulate. But if you look at a decentralized smart contract or a protocol, and there's a risk of rugging, there's a risk of custody loss, there's a risk of something that happened with FTX, for instance, lack of segregation between the spot assets and the derivative assets, between the margin and the non-margin assets. And I think those become areas of focus that regulators should look to, because if they present the same risk, I think the same sort of principles should apply. One other thing I think is liquidity. And I think this is one area that, for me, it's quite interesting because if you look at all the liquidity that's happening in industry, traditional finance, it's not that market sort of different, but there's a lot of liquidity that is moving in between centralized and decentralized exchanges. And so as we think about how we regulate centralized and decentralized exchanges, I think regulators should be very keenly aware that if they actually turn up the knob on one side of the spectrum, it's going to drive liquidity to other sides of the to somewhere else. And so if you make it very hard for centralized exchanges to service customers to actually try to comply with the laws, then a lot of the liquidity is just going to go into the decentralized exchange, where regulators, even though they want to, for instance, take a more conservative approach and regulate the centralized exchanges more, is ultimately just going to cause the opposite effect, because all the liquidity, all the users are just going to go to decentralized exchanges. Same thing, if you try to apply outdated tools, outdated principles of regulation to decentralized exchanges, and make it very hard for people to even code or write computer software, I think that's going to have unintended consequences as well.
That's a good example of market influence as well. So turning then to Emma, top 20 influential women in crypto and head of EMEA for GBBC. What's the industry's take on this?
I think they'd agree with a lot of what's already been said, actually. And look, there's a reason that DeFi was left out of MiCA. It is very complicated to regulate. What we are very focused on at the moment is bringing industry together, bringing regulators together. It is all about that education that John mentioned, I think, and truly, really understanding it, which is difficult to at the moment. I think we're heading in a direction. I mean, obviously, we're talking about decentralized exchanges, but when you're talking about the wider industry, we're still not there with regulation fully yet. So what will come in 2025? I think a lot will happen in 2025, particularly with the change in US government, and we will see an uptick in regulation and those regulatory frameworks. Talking about, can we regulate DEXs? I don't think we can yet. Maybe we can in the future, but at the moment I think it's a little too difficult.
Well, it's interesting to see, because we see Bermuda this week, quite unhelpfully, issued their first license for a DEX with Gravity, seeing how that's going to work in function, whether it's going to be operational. Who knows? I agree with John's point about, from a universal standpoint, how does that work? There's no uniformity in approach there. But then going back to you in regards to what do you view as the main risks then, or what's the industry telling you the risk? We've heard a little bit before about AML concerns, KYC concerns, but really, is that what you're hearing?
I mean, the main risks with DEXs for me are like any type of trading, it's losing money. And, you know, a lot of the time, I think that can be user error. So the big risk with DEXs is that you have to have a very good understanding of what you're doing. And many people on those platforms will, but there will be some every single day that absolutely don't. And so that's the main risk. You know, how do you educate those people to what they're really doing, what they're really trading? You know, very simple things like losing your private keys. Do people fully understand the risks that they take when they step onto these platforms, that they are not covered, there is no insurance, there isn't customer service phone line that you can call up. So for me, and unsurprisingly coming from me, a lot of it is about education and how we increase that.
Okay. Right. John, then to you very briefly. Obviously you were involved in the discussions we touched on at the European Commission. You've been part of Uniswap now, remarkable growth with Uniswap. Do you think if we could find a way for regulation to be introduced, that it could be done so without stifling that growth, that innovation that DEXs naturally are drawn to?
I think it could ultimately land in a spot where it would be as beneficial as it might be like restrictive, in the sense that something we would have to get used to. I think to Can's point, I think one of the issues I have when I speak to regulators, and having been one myself, I know it's not something you want to hear, but if you want to actually find a future where you do some type of DeFi regulation, you're going to have to compromise more than you're used to. Because to your point exactly, there will be technically decentralized protocols. There will be protocols that have sufficiently distributed governance that they're also decentralized, but they might, for some specific function, they need to be able to upgrade those smart contracts. Some will be simpler and you will never ever change them. But then when you go to that very commercialized interface / wallet layer, the question is, what are the comparisons to CeFi? Where are the risks the same? Where could you easily implement some consumer protection rules? And I think to Emma's point, I think one of the things that we are using, or we're seeing now as a competitive advantage, is to be the interface where you did not get scammed. So there is a lot of self-regulation already taking place. There are companies that, we try to do a lot of different things. We try to create a new protocol, we try to create a chain, we try to create a wallet. So we're spread pretty thin, but there are also companies that just do the wallet stuff, right? And there's a lot of competition there. To give you an example, I think on any given day on the Uniswap protocol, in terms of volume, our proprietary interfaces, like where we actually make any money, can be around 7 or 8% of the overall volume. So the rest is either market makers going directly, or it's competitors who are simply building better applications to allow users to go to the protocol. I think the French put out a paper more than a year ago where they kind of went from the perspective of acknowledging that these do exist. There is a new type of tool that users will use to connect and trade, and it's not the same as a centralized exchange. And then the question is, then what? What could be feasibly applied to them, right? And I think the best that I've seen is that it comes down to disclosures. There could also be an idea where the mainstream interfaces that provide the user with the tools to use the blockchain, they have to assess the protocol they send users to. So they have to make sure that they're not sending them to something where all their tokens will be siphoned away, or where they have to do both a security test but also an economic test of the smart contract. So these are just like things that the French already imagined could be one of the things that you could do.
So regulating the operators and not the technology.
So yeah, so looking at the access points or the tools, and then having them kind of impose the restrictions, in the sense that if you knew your user would not be safe on one DEX but on another, you would probably start sending only to the ones where you know what's going on. To your point about transparency as well.
Yeah.
So that's the tools on the protocol. Then, Charles, turning to you then, behind the protocol, use of DAOs and DLTs, heavily involved in that space. What is the role of regulation when it comes to DAOs? We know that there's a great framework now in the ADGM, but what's your views on that?
So DAOs, maybe for people which are not familiar with the term DAO, DAO stands for Decentralized Autonomous Organization. They are some kind of new limited companies. They are kind of new legal status for this digital organic or digital organism, I would say. And the big challenge with DAOs is we need to find for them like a legal status. Are they a limited company? Are they an association? After you get some more clarity, and many regulators are working on this here in Abu Dhabi as well as some others, after you get a legal status for DAOs, you get a little bit more, the next topic coming on is actually what do you do with the token holders? Are the token holders shareholders? Are they participants of a new kind? And therefore you need to define what kind of participants they are. Some token holders might be just holding the token. Some token holders might be participating in the governance of the DAO and essentially steering the directions of the protocol itself. So do they have a different role and different responsibilities? Some token holders might decide to contribute to the network itself by being stakers, for example. So these are hard questions, and I think many regulators now are into the taxonomy stage where they try to map these new roles and this new kind of organization. The big challenge when you get like the legal status of a DAO settled, as well as a good understanding of what are the stakeholders of those DAOs, then comes taxation, a topic very close to the heart of many governments, obviously, and which is necessary and good. So how do you tax these token holders which are coming from multiple jurisdictions, and it depends mostly where is this DAO kind of anchored. Is it a DAO under Abu Dhabi regulations or Cayman or some others? And when you've got all this work done, legal status, token holders kind of definitions, taxations, come also like kind of investigations to make sure you don't overlap too much with securities laws, which exist for a good reason for a number of years. And you're really on the fringe of it, right? Where actually a token holder is not a shareholder per se, but you want to make sure you're not overlapping or getting over this red line. So DAOs are very, very experimental. They're very new, but they're also new type of corporations, global corporations in a way. So I think it's very important to have those questions settled. I think there is a lot of research being done here in Abu Dhabi. There is an open consultation, I think, which was released last week. So I really encourage everyone to be engaged with the regulators and not only claiming, but educating, because there is a lot of good intention. And there is a global competition between all those jurisdictions to make the best of the digital asset economy.
No, indeed. Indeed. Can, just to you for 1 minute. John touched on an important point. He said, there's a lot of self-regulation currently. That's what we heard when the centralized exchanges were coming through the regulatory frame. We've seen the SEC, the CFTC regulating through enforcement. What lessons learned from the centralized exchange do you think that the regulators need to know at this stage? In 1 minute, please.
So maybe I'll answer a slightly different question. So when I came here, I looked up the definition of regulate just on online, Merriam-Webster. And the definition is to bring under the control or dominion of. And to me, regulation is fundamentally about human behavior. It's about fundamentally what we can do to make people do the right thing. And so, for instance, it doesn't make sense to regulate a piece of stone, a piece of, a mountain or a river. And I think one thing that I keep coming back to is, other than sort of the more public laws that have been out there, the SEC, CFTC, there's actually been a body of case law in an analogous space, P2P file sharing. It's been actually around for over 20, 30 years. And there's actually a body of laws on how to actually think about regulating behaviors in the space, different players in the space, instead of the software, instead of the decentralized P2P immutable software contracts. For instance, there's a very famous case, 2007, US Supreme Court, Grokster, whereby a fully decentralized P2P file sharing software, the developers of that software was found liable because they had specifically marketed that piece of software for illegal purposes. And that makes sense if you just go back to first principles. Like, I can manufacture a knife if I sell it to a chef, but if I try to sell it to someone knowing that he's going to kill someone, that's wrong. So anyways, take up more time. But
That's fantastic. I think time's up now, but one last question. Charles, should DEXs be regulated as of December 2024?
Say it again?
Should DEXs be regulated as of today? Yes or no?
Operators should be regulated, not the technology.
Can?
no.
No. Jean?
No.
Emma?
I'm in between.
Okay. Thank you all very much for your time this afternoon. Much appreciated.
Thank you, everyone.